Well, it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator for our third session. Dr. Nancy Frackenberry is the John Phillips Professor of Religion Emerita at Dartmouth College. She's past president of the Metaphysical Society of America and the Institute for American Religious and Philosophical Thought. Her research centers on pragmatism and neo-pragmatism, religious naturalism, philosophy of religions, and feminist philosophy. And she's the author of a variety of books spanning these kinds of topics. She's currently finishing a book tentatively titled Pragmatism and the End of Religion, a provocative title. In short, she's an excellently positioned to moderate this session, which is titled Panpsychism and Religious Naturalism. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Nancy Frackenberry.
Good afternoon. I guess that's right. I am emerita, but ladies, watch it. If you retire soon, don't become emerita and be introduced, as I was mistakenly recently by a Dartmouth student, as Professor Nancy Emerita. I think emeritus is a safer Latin form. Our first speaker this afternoon is a graduate of this very institution, having done an MA first at Boston University under Bob Neville. He came to Claremont for the PhD, which formed the basis for the first of two books. The first one is entitled, and we will be hearing about it today, God the Created, Pragmatic Constructive Realism in Philosophy and Theology, SUNY Press. It is an attempt to do, those of you who recall the debate between John Cobb and Bob Neville, a famous debate, to do what is virtually impossible for those principles to do, Ben Chicka has accomplished, I think, in this book, and that is to syncretize, harmonize, through the use of purse, the two positions, ground of being, theology represented by Neville, and the process perspective represented by John Cobb. His second book, I'm less familiar with game theory, is entitled Plain as Others, Theology and Ethical Responsibility in Video Games. But I am told that this is a very hot topic and that the most creative and agile minds are drawn to game theory. So we'll let the audience interrogate Dr. Chicka further on that if you're interested. His title today is Trade in Panpsychism for Biosemiotics and Enjoy the Theological Benefits Today.
I drive a 2000 Ford Mustang, which I begrudgingly admit is now a rather old vehicle. But with age comes familiarity and a certain amount of fondness. My Mustang also has a manual transmission, and stick shifts are just fun to drive. I might be vain in this regard, but I also tend to like my model more than the newer looks. However, as much as I like my vehicle, it's hard to deny that others just do some things better. I live in the greater Boston area, and driving on snow or ice in a rear-wheel drive sports car is not for the faint of heart. In the case of winter driving, a slight modification in the form of maybe tires that were meant to handle the snowy terrain might make it so that my vehicle can now traverse the snowy terrain. However, I have a friend who is now interested in scaling jagged rocks and mountains. In terms of off-roading, rugged stretches of terrain, my Mustang is not up to the task. I would need a new vehicle to navigate that terrain. I come to the topic of panpsychism as an American pragmatist. Charles Peirce, like many process philosophers, affirmed panpsychism. What terrain can that theory navigate well? Rather than having to deal with the problem of how mind can come from matter, complex human minds are expected and explained on panpsychist accounts because all fundamental realities are mental. At the micro level, there are realities that are subjects of experience, and human subjectivity is explained by subjectivity at that basic level. As Peirce put it, matter is effete mind, inveterate habits becoming physical laws. He expected the success of science because the minds of scientists have always had a literal affinity with mind and nature. If this is where panpsychism seems to succeed, where it runs into trouble is trying to make sense of emergence, genuine leaps that are connected to yet different from that from which they emerged. Panpsychism is a conceptual vehicle unable to traverse this emergent terrain, but another concept is well equipped for the journey: biosemiotics. Scientific explanations require and necessarily relate to more fundamental levels of nature. You need to know physics to know how chemistry works. You need both those to understand biology and the origin of life. We get classical physics from quantum physics, which leads to physical chemistry, then biochemistry, then genetics, and so on. This characterization of science does not mean that reductionism is true and everything is just matter bumping into each other. Emergence theories point to the truth of downward dependence in science without granting downward reduction when explaining all phenomenon. If panpsychism were true, and the same explanation of every concrete event can be given anywhere at any time, it is not doing any work in explaining how the great diversity of life came to be, continues to evolve, and how relations prompted such diversity. According to emergence theory, we can speak of experiences and subjectivity once they emerge with their own efficacy, but not everywhere and everywhere. Furthermore, when life does emerge, biosemiotics reveals that unconscious interpretation in nature is the basis upon which more complex mental interpretations developed. Semiosis is more fundamental than psyche. Terence Deacon continues to be a leading figure in work on emergence and identifies three emergent orders or layers of reality. First order emergence describes new aggregate properties not found in individuals, such as water molecules producing and sustaining waves. Second order emergence, there are not just new collective properties, but novel causal effects. In chaotic systems, structural forms and not just individual particles are responsible for further development of the form. The way snowflakes form unique formations is an example of this. In third order emergence, information is passed on and not just structural features. Self-replicating cells do not just have a structure allowing the development of other parts of the cell, they have information for self-replicating. At this order of emergence, it might be tempting to claim that cells exhibit mental agency by displaying something like the minimal purpose-driven behavior of replication. However, work coming out of the world of biosemiotics indicates that cells unconsciously interpret their environment, and that it's only living entities capable of such semiotic responses, not physical entities. At the physical level, cause and effect are mathematizable and predictable. Purpose centers at the biological level, but not before. Now, in terms of grappling with the implications of modern science, I'm fully aware that panpsychists do not mean that things like rocks have human experiences, just that everything actual undergoes experience. Conscious human experience is therefore just a refined development of this omnipresent feature of reality, one in which present reactions to the past can introduce novel changes as opposed to entirely conforming to past experiences. But if the societies of occasions that make up a rock contribute nothing new and simply decide to repeat the pattern of the preceding moment, I do not know what explanatory power referring to that society as having mental experience achieves. That is predictable cause and effect. On the other hand, affirming mental experiences and reactions to those experiences are emergent features is a position that includes greater diversity and pluralism in its ontology. Features typically prized by panpsychists and process thinkers in this room. If the same ontology applies everywhere, references to novelty are actually in word, not fact. Novelty issue aside, the takeaway from emergence should be that there's another option besides interpreting the world as containing mind everywhere in a seemingly unscientific way and accepting science but losing your mind in the process, so to speak. Biosemiotics adds a wrinkle to these emergent levels. It indicates that there could be a living world without minds, but no life without the use of signs. Rather, self-controlled human intelligence is just a complex example of what happens automatically even in single-cell organisms. The conversion of physical signs into conventional information useful for survival. Peirce, despite his affirmation of panpsychism, was ahead of his time on this point. Those working on emergence and biosemiotics rely heavily on his semiotic theory, in which interpretation involves signs, objects to which the signs refer, and the dynamic respects with which that object is engaged through the sign by an active interpreter. More simply stated, signs have objects to which they refer, but they also have effects on interpreters of the sign that direct them to the object with varying degrees of success. Only through active interpretation is it possible for a sign to be taken as conveying any information at all, even in single-cell organisms all the way to intelligent animals. The way information is communicated among parts of a bacteria is a hypothesis about how it can survive in its environment that will in turn be tested by that environment, with the success or failure of that hypothesis entailing the survival or death of the bacteria. Now, panpsychists could argue against these claims by asking how mind can emerge from non-mind, the typical mind from matter problem it is meant to solve. But note how Jesper Hoffmeyer, a leading figure in biosemiotics, emphasizes the great degree of freedom and growth of possibilities that becomes possible at the emergent level of signification. The most pronounced feature of organic evolution is not the creation of a multiplicity of amazing morphological structures, but the general expansion of semiotic freedom. That is to say, the increase of richness or depth of meaning that can be communicated, from pheromones to birdsong, and from antibodies to Japanese ceremonies of welcome. First, through unconscious interpretation, nature develops its own unrealized possibilities through biosemiosis. And those possibilities do not need to be read into all of nature as always having been matters of fact for them to be realizable in the future. An example from Hoffmeyer will either clarify this point or confuse you. The digital codes of DNA are passive. This means that they need analogical signification. So while the digital code is singular and passively passed on from generation to generation, there are a plurality of analogical forms that result from interactions between organisms and environments. And the play between digital and analog is semiotic freedom. So this is my example. It's the unicellular algae Acetabularia acetabulum. You can forget the name, it's easy to picture. It's got a very simple root system where there's the rhizoid and the genome. From there, a simple stem grows, and then a disc-shaped flat cap develops. If you take scissors and cut the stem, the rhizoid with the genome will regenerate an identical cap in its place. The part that was cut will die shortly after, and this seems to confirm the obvious that morphogenesis, the origin of living entities' forms, is exclusive to the genome, the digital code of DNA. But the interesting fact that necessitates a biosemiotic explanation rather than one in which genes simply determine life is that if you cut the rhizoid with the genome, cut the stem, and cut the cap, cut all three, the stem and not the rhizoid will show the ability to produce a new cap. The morphogenetic process is not the direct product of genes alone, since in the stem it continues to go on without the genes. And that's the important point. In simpler terms, independent interpretations of the cytoplasm in the stem are required to explain what's happening here. Digital codes carry life forward. We share DNA. We got it from our parents. But they do not fully control the way that they form biological structures. Living analog codes are needed for that. Another way of expressing this is that organisms and their features are not determined by simple two-party cause and effect because a third party is always involved. The third party is an active interpretation that determines the precise manner in which causal bases produce their effects. As Hoffmeyer puts it, contrary to physically based interactions, semiotic interactions do not depend on any direct causal connection between the sign vehicle and the effect. Instead, the two events are connected through the intervention of an interpretive response. The point is that in semiotic interactions, the causal machinery of the receptive system itself is in charge of producing the behavior. So we have a picture here in which semiotic freedom allows nature to develop its own possibilities, including the eventual development of mentality. Once life emerges, unconscious biosemiosis leads to more mental semiosis and eventually complicated forms of semiosis that are more likely to appear in conversations about philosophy and theology. Now, if this all sounds unconvincing still, or if panpsychism is too precious a conceptual tool to let go, consider this list of features which biosemiotics shares in common with panpsychism and those who typically defend it. Biological evolution is not just about competition, because cooperation is present even before consciousness. It is a naturalistic position, but not reductively materialistic. It is also against dualisms, which avoid such reduction by making the interaction between mind and matter impossible to fathom. The British empiricists were wrong to make sense experience primary. It's an abstraction from more primarily causal bodily experiences. And when it comes to religious implications, religious feelings and statements are not poetry. They're part of nature, just like non-conscious interpretation. So regarding religious naturalism, if nature is sufficient in the sense that independent supernatural realities are to be avoided in theology, then why speak of religious naturalism instead of just naturalism? Amongst religious naturalists, there's a debate regarding the usefulness of referring to God and deploying religious language while operating out of a purely natural standpoint, with those answering in the affirmative often reinterpreting that language to be a meaningful and sometimes beautifully poetic way of speaking about natural processes understood in more mundane ways. However, an alternative conclusion to draw is that God talk and religious concepts are superfluous human constructions added on top of what is already perfectly well understood. That is precisely the conclusion Laurent Schultz has drawn after an early career writing classic Christian systematic theology. He has since concluded that all models of God are nothing but constructions of the human mind, and God is dead. All of this looks very different from a biosemiotic perspective. Constructions are part and parcel of nature. They're not opaque layers added to and covering up a genuine understanding of nature. Human interpretations are continuous, with unconscious interpretation found in the rest of nature. From a biosemiotic perspective, unless you're prepared to criticize an amoeba for avoiding harmful chemicals, constructing religious language appears to be a very natural and meaningful thing to do. It is not pointless just because constructed. Our interpretations of religious traditions are more than just constructions. Now, for philosophical theologians who want to heed their Promethean calling and ponder the nature of being, the question of the one and the many, and affirm something more about God without reverting to supernaturalisms of old, I want to sketch how changes biosemiotics requires of a form of theology typically considered antithetical to process theology actually brings the two closer together, before concluding with a brief remark on how process theologians might incorporate biosemiotics. Ground of being theologians in the lineage of Paul Tillich and Robert Neville make it abundantly clear that God is not an existing thing, much less a personal being. God is the ontological condition for the possibility of this world and the value achieved in it. This position is not supernatural because God is not an entity that created, but more like a limiting principle that accounts for existence. God is the unconditional explanation for the conditional world. Existence, personhood, and other conditional features cannot literally apply to God. It's good apophatic theology. Religious language participates in what grounds it, but such language is broken. God is indeterminate is all that can literally be said. Much more can be said from within a ground of being framework informed by biosemiotics. Religious signs do not just participate in their ultimate explanation. They also transform the God from which they emerged. God is not just indeterminate, all symbols broken. When religious communities interpret God as loving and that sign influences their behavior, that entire semiotic process develops God's identity. God has the potential to be intimately immanent in the world, though that is a potential that needs to be achieved. The previous example of digital and analog codes and natural signification could be extended into thinking about the relationship between God and the world and how this change works. Whatever about God's nature is coded in reality that determines God as creator of this reality or as the unconditioned ground of the conditioned world does not control its own interpretation. Living, intelligent beings are needed for that. Our interpretations and behaviors they prompt can make the ultimate reality more imminent and intimate in the world. In ground of being theology, the divine is not a thing or an entity, but with biosemiotics in place, that austere apophatic ultimate is now also more than that. It is also tied to our personalities and our ideals, just like semiotic interpretations and the rest of nature. So if you followed my example, just like the stalk, the stem is a symbol of mediation between the genome and the product of the cap in that algae I talked about. We are symbols mediating between God and the world. With biosemiotics in place, instead of apophatic silence in the face of the ultimate, anything more about God's nature hinges on our contributions in a crucial manner. Now, can similar conclusions be drawn from biosemiotics for process theologians, who typically claim there is more to be said about God's nature than their ground of being brethren? I think so. Even with the primordial nature of God luring all creatures in the world and the consequent nature of God responding to the decisions those creatures make, really what meaningful relationship exists between God and fundamental particles? If process panpsychists claim that these entities simply repeat their immediate past and that their subjective mental contributions are negligible, why is God luring them in the first place? That relationship in which past patterns are just continued is certainly not doing much to change the world and make it better reflect the divine envisagement of possibility at any moment. Of course, I have argued that such entities do not have the mental capacities to respond, but rather than bad news for process theologians, biosemiotics only heightens something that is already of crucial importance to process theology. That something is really the importance of listening to and heeding the religious calling. Without agents feeling and responding to God all throughout reality, it really does matter whether religious individuals and their communities are radically open and loving or closed off and hateful. The future depends on it because nothing at lower levels of emergence is capable of making such choices. Biosemiotics highlights the important role that people's choices play in responding to God, even more than is typical within process theology, which is already a lot, to put it mildly. Now, compared to the way I have described the takeaway for ground of being theology, differences about God's primordial nature would obviously remain, but the elevated role of interpreters for God's consequent nature could be accepted without difficulty, I think. In this sense, biosemiotics and process theology are natural allies. So whether you call yourself a religious naturalist or a philosophical theologian of the non-supernatural variety, I think the following is true in light of biosemiotics. If religion is a quest for human transformation towards the true, the good, and the beautiful, and away from their opposites, and sign transformations are deeply rooted in nature prior to human signification, then nothing is more natural than to embark on the religious quest and answer a calling to transform self and world to better embody ideals that would otherwise be lacking without our active contributions. That is the terrain that biosemiotics can help you navigate if you take it out for a spin. Thank you.